Okay, for those of you that are in the Zoom meeting, welcome to the Environmental Committee meeting for the third quarter. Um, I wanted to, I tell you what, Tara, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about what's going on with the chamber right now.
So I'll just kick it off and thank you all for joining us today. And Michael, thank you for making your time available to share your expertise. Getting our hands around permitting and the changes in permitting is one of the practical tools we provide, not just to our members, but to the business community. So we will record this and we'll make sure these slides and this content is made available, if that's all right with everyone, to our members going forward. So those that signed up for the call, but for some reason aren't joining us, will have access to that information too. This committee, which Chris so ably chairs, really aspires to dig into those issues that either ease our work of building a prosperous, high-functioning business community or challenge it, and how we share that information and provide prompt, up-to-date information for our members is one of the values that we provide. So we only do that, my friends, because people like Michael make their time available. I'm an expert in nothing, and I won't speak for the rest of you because I see much more expertise on this call than me. But I will take just one more minute to say that the Chamber of Commerce has been as proactive as we can possibly be in helping this economy to get back to work in a safe fashion, and one that allows all portions of our economy to come back together. Because how we get our schools and universities open, how we manage the subsets of our community are all critical to our economy staying open and continuing to manage past this pandemic. So 4 months ago, I was hoping this was a fast and furious circumstance. It looks like it's going to be one that requires diligence for a long period of time. But if there's one thing that we're here to do, it's to make sure that as we identify the needs and challenges of our members and of our greater business community, we step up and find the resources to help address them. So I keep that pledge in front of each of you that I have the chance to speak to. When you have a challenge or when you know of a business that does, I hope you'll put them in touch so we can do all we can to connect them with small business, with financing options, with whatever they need to weather this storm and keep our region's economy flourishing. But we can't do any of that if we can't build and site and continue to put the logistics and the infrastructure in place to make our region a welcoming place for future business investment. And I told Michael before we got on the call that, you know, I spent the last decade and a half in the Quad Cities, which straddles the Mississippi River. So I'm not new to having to sort my way through issues of flood and floodway management and construction in water that dabbles with the edge of waterways. So I'm looking forward to hearing the latest and becoming more knowledgeable about this topic myself. So I will tell you that if you haven't used Zoom a lot and you have a question and want to put it in the chat, that would be very welcome. I think Chris and certainly I will keep an eye on those questions and make sure that we circulate them up and make this a robust conversation for all of us. But with that, I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for giving me a couple minutes. It's all yours, Chris.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of people that are going to join us late here, it looks like, but I want to go ahead and Michael Sears with Morley has been gracious enough to provide the topic for this quarter, floodway permitting in Indiana. But a little bit about Michael. He's the water resource engineer with Morley Engineers in Newburgh/Evansville. He has been with the firm for 24 years and holds a BS and MS degrees in agricultural engineering from Purdue University. So he's a Purdue guy for all you IU fans. He's a registered PE with the state of Indiana as a certified floodplain manager and of the Association of State Floodplain Managers. And he's active in the Indiana Association for Floodplain and Stormwater Management and has served as the executive board secretary and treasurer. when I went out looking for a speaker for this topic, I asked like 2 or 3 people, and Michael's name came to the surface pretty quick, and so we're lucky to have him. But he also holds memberships in the Agricultural and Biological Engineers Society and the American Society of Civil Engineers. And his current responsibilities are primarily centered on hydraulic and hydrogeologic and hydraulic assessments for modeling and project design in support of local, state, and federal waterways permitting. Michael is an Indiana native, originally from a small family near Lafayette. He's married with 3 children and has hobbies including camping and photography. And again, Michael, thank you very much for doing this for us today. And with that, we'll get started.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that kind introduction. I appreciate it. Guess we'll just go ahead and jump in. This is an overview, the agenda of things I'd like to try and cover today.
Michael, you're probably going to have to keep your volume up a little bit higher.
Better? Is that any better or not? Can you hear me better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Okay. All right, good. I want to start out with some an overview. What is a floodplain? What is a floodway? Talk about regulations, applications, exemptions, some early coordination. What goes into a construction in a floodway permit application with the DNR Division of Water. Some information resources that they have available on their website to make that process easier. When you have to do computer modeling or HEC-RES modeling, we've heard it referred to as, and when you don't have to do that. Talk a little bit about mitigation, which comes into the process through the Division of Fish and Wildlife with DNR. Hit briefly on some local projects we've worked on in recent years, and do some Q&A at the end. So with that, I'll jump in. This whole issue of floodplains and floodways really stems out of the National Flood Insurance Program. It is a partnership between local, federal, and state levels of government. In the past, our country has seen several significant floods. In our part of the world, we've seen major floods in 1913 on the Ohio and Wabash, 1927 on the Mississippi. Flood of record here in Evansville was 1937 on the Ohio. There was a substantial event in 1961 on Pigeon Creek. There have been several others. And there's been various levels of governmental response to those over the years. And over time, that eventually led to the National Flood Insurance Act in 1968 and an amendment in 1973. The initial act created the flood insurance program. It made it available and started to create maps, floodplain maps, so people knew if they were in a flood plain, and that assisted in the insurance process of trying to figure out what your premium may be, for example. That initial effort, though, did not, it was optional. No one made you buy flood insurance. It was up to you. The amendment in 73 added the mandatory purchase requirement, which many people may be familiar with. It essentially tied flood insurance to being mandatory if you had a loan mortgage, for example, from a federally backed institution. Essentially, the banks needed to have their collateral insured if they were in the floodplain. At the state level, the Flood Control Act here has been on the books beginning in 1945. And then beyond that, individual cities, towns, and counties each adopt their own local ordinances that are within the bounds of what FEMA establishes through the NFIP, and then additional requirements at the state layers on top of that. And then beyond that, their individual communities are allowed to be more restrictive if they so choose. And some in Indiana do that. I've got just a few screens of some definitions. Normally, I hate it when presenters just read definitions, so bear with me for just a couple of screens and we'll get past this. Essentially, what is a floodplain? The Natural Resources Commission essentially defines that as an area adjoining the river or stream that may have been or could be covered with floodwater. So you can see in the picture there on the right, that is Pigeon Creek, where it discharges into the Ohio River during the 1937 flood. It was actually a few days before the peak, but you can see that covers a pretty large area. Beyond that, the state code kind of whittles that down a little bit to define the regulatory flood, which we use is the 100-year 1% chance flood. That can be it's viewed as a flood that has a 1% chance or probability of occurring once in any given year. You can have multiple 100-year floods in a year. You can have them year after year. If you start to see that happening a lot, at some point you might want to reevaluate what are we calling the 100-year flood and reassess that probability. The state code goes on to call out two different portions of the floodplain. One is the floodway that we're here to talk about today, and then the fringe, which is what's left in the floodplain beyond the floodway. It also clarifies the scope of state jurisdiction as being only along streams that have at least 1 square mile of drainage area or watershed. Once you get that far up into the watershed and you go below that threshold, you're no longer a state jurisdiction. You still be in local jurisdiction, but that's the end of the state requirements as you travel up a watershed. Indiana code defines the floodway as a minimum of being the channel, and then the parts of the adjacent floodplain that need to carry water efficiently and move it downstream. The county ordinance here, and other counties have very similar, if not identical, ordinances as do cities and towns. A little bit longer definition. It says it's the channel or stream, creek, ditch, etc., and keyword there again being and portions of the floodplain that are adjacent to move that peak flow downstream. So what does that look like? This is a schematic that shows up in essentially every flood insurance study that FEMA publishes. It defines the regulatory floodway. FEMA's glossary, online glossary definition, floodway there again talks about channel and adjacent lands. It includes, though, another consideration for cumulative effect, and that's what this little exhibit here starts to get at. What you're seeing, I'm going to turn on this. Can you see the red highlighter? Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay, so in this example, the dark heavy line is the existing ground elevation, channel being here in the middle. So an assessment was done, and the floodplain was determined to be points A to B, the dashed line horizontally across that cross section. To look at the concept of a floodway, you begin to fill, or the term is encroach, into the overbanks, both left and right, to a point that it causes that same flow rate to increase in elevation by some prescribed surcharge. And when you look at that, you will try and do an assessment so that you're taking equally in terms of the capacity. The term used is conveyance, away from both sides as evenly as possible. Sometimes it's disproportionate to begin with, but that's the goal. That surcharge is defined by some governing authority. So in the core NFIP regulations that FEMA prescribes, that surcharge is actually a foot. In Indiana, the State Flood Control Act has modified that so that our floodways are based on 1/10 of a foot surcharge. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as 1400ths or less than 1500ths. When we actually do the calculations to either define a floodway or to assess the impacts of a project on a water surface profile, we can do the math to 2 decimal places, and 0.14 rounds to quote 1/10, which is how it's written in the code. So if you've seen those numbers before, we're sure exactly where they came from. That is that's their basis. Other communities, some in Kentucky, for example, may still rely on the 1-foot surcharge. They have what's called a zero rise floodway. So in our case in Indiana, wanted to do a project, you've got 1400ths of a foot to play with in terms of your impact on the water elevations before and after your project might be constructed. In Kentucky, or any other state or community that has a zero rise floodway, you can only do minor projects. You need to basically be able to show that your change is 0.00 feet in those instances. So they have a higher surcharge. So the floodway becomes narrower, but there's very little, if any, room to play with in terms of doing projects in them. So the key takeaway here is that you have a surcharge, and then looking at that surcharge cumulatively. This next screen kind of looks at that maybe a little bit prettier view. In this example, you should think of the factory on the far left and the homes on the right as maybe being existing, and then a proposed project may be kicked around that would create an additional factory or an expansion on fill. And as you can see here too, that originally the floodplain was at this elevation, but by starting to fill in the floodplain, it can increase the elevations, and left unchecked, that can affect people, existing structures that were there before. The other thing about this is is drawn maybe just in one single cross section, or if these are all together, but also think of this in the context of going upstream. So maybe this house here is a half a mile upstream, this one is a quarter mile upstream. So it's not only looking at what you do at your site if you're proposing a project or delineating and creating a floodway. You need to look and see how, as you do that assessment, what happens upstream, and keep that all in mind and look at it cumulatively over time too, as you go forward. We'll kind of touch back on that after a bit here on the application side, and looking at how things maybe change over time if you're doing a detailed assessment. So where do you go to find if you're in a floodway? These are some older FEMA firm panel maps from Evansville and Vanderburgh County. These were published in the 80s. What we're showing here is Pigeon Creek, where it crosses US 41. And what you may see about this is that the county and the city are published on two different maps. This was kind of cumbersome. They don't do this anymore. You'll also notice, though, that along the creek, there is no floodway. You just see zone A9 and some elevations here at 380, for example, is what's published. You come over here to this same point. This is where 41 crosses the creek. And on the county side, you don't see a floodway either. The Pigeon Creek floodway was studied and came to be official, I guess, in the mid-90s, as I understand it. And that has since been rolled into our current map. So this is the effective firm panel for that same area. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on that same bridge crossing. So now you can see you have white horizontal hatching, or not horizontal, but angled hatching. And that denotes the floodway in conjunction with this cyan line that those cross-hatching lines terminate into. That is your floodway. The light blue speckled areas are the 100-year floodplain, and then the black dots denote the, what in the past has been termed the 500-year floodplain. It's actually termed as shaded zone X. And then beyond that is what FEMA now calls this zone X, or on older maps, which was called zone C, which is commonly thought of as just being, quote, out of the floodplain. It's still in the zone, but that is kind of a change in nomenclature with these newer series of maps. So with this revision to the maps, the city and county became published in one study, a countywide assessment, and that makes looking at things a little easier. They brought in some things that were missing from the prior maps. This is an even better way of looking at it. FEMA has an online tool. Web address is down here in blue. I believe the intention is that we're going to share this presentation with people, and so I'll create this as a PDF with these hyperlinks active. So as you see these through the presentation, keep in mind that you'll be able to go back and link through to some of these websites if you so choose in the future. This is the east side of Evansville. This is the Harper watershed. It's actually an area that our firm worked on. I actually drew these floodways for FEMA. That was an involved project. We did a reassessment of the area from essentially the interstate to Wesselman Woods, and from Pigeon Creek down to a little way south of Lloyd, with a series of ditches and streams that are crisscross that area. And that was some years ago. Prior to that assessment, the area really wasn't mapped as I think anything more than really a 500-year zone. So this was a significant change for that portion of the community. One thing I will note about this website is that it can be very slow to load, so just be patient. What you can do here, what you see in this area, is you can go into this tool, click that you want to make what's called a format, which is an excerpt of an official FEMA map. And you can save that as a PDF on letter size, 11 by 17, maybe even legal sized sheets if you need to include that into a report, for example. Other sources of floodplain and floodway information come to us from the DNR, to the Division of Water. Their go-to tool is NFIP, or the Indiana Floodplain Information Portal, here on the right. When you first go into it through these links, you can zoom down to the county level, type in a street address, however you want to get to where you're curious about. And you can click along a stream like I have here. It will create, or excuse me, you click on your site of interest. So this is Lowe's on the east side of Evansville. So you can click on that and it will come back and give you an estimate of the base flood elevation. And then the line is here of the cross hatching again is telling you that that's where the floodway is in proximity to where you clicked. You can download a report. You can create an official submittal to DNR with this wizard. I'm not going to go through that. Basically, you click on it, put in some contact information. You can request it, something that's more official than just, you know, something off of the website. But in this case, it's showing you the elevations that come out of the official effective FEMA study. And that's when you get your official letter back, it should be what you're seeing here. Other sources that DNR have, maybe for areas that aren't studied, those are termed A zones typically, or approximate zones, where there is no floodway and there are no base flood elevations that are published. It's just shading on the map and it says it's a floodplain. So DNR, a few years ago, released results of what they called their A zone project. They went through and did a massive assessment of over 18,000 miles of streams in the state of Indiana that were published by FEMA as A zones, and that did not have elevations, did not have floodways. And they came up with approximate floodways and approximate elevations and published those in the NFIP portal. And they term that as best available information. It's a term you'll often see a lot in the floodplain world. There can be a lot of uncertainty. You oftentimes don't have all the data you need to make as detailed of an assessment as you like. And sometimes you just have to go with what you have. That's best available. One thing I'd like to point out on this particular assessment, though, that they did is I've noticed some discrepancies or questions. So in the lower left here, this light blue area is what is published as the Zone A FEMA official floodplain. And you can see that their floodway is much wider. If you recall from our discussion a few minutes ago, that the floodway is supposed to be the channel and then part of the floodplain. It can be all of the floodplain, but in this case, it's wider than the floodplain. So I actually have an inquiry into DNR to get some official feedback on how we're supposed to interpret instances such as this, and I haven't gotten an answer yet. But this is kind of illustrates one aspect of this, the world of floodplains and floodways. And sometimes there's conflicting information, and part of it's just to work through it. You do a lot of communication, in particular with DNR, local floodplain officials, to get people on the same page and maybe agree on a path forward when you do have inconsistencies with which to deal. So through here with the different layers here of this section of their web page, you can toggle these on and off and do comparisons, zoom in and zoom out, and things of that nature. So here. Other sources of floodplain and floodway information might come from individual stream reports. This was an assessment done for the city and county for Little Pigeon Creek and Locust Creek back in about 1981, I think is when this was published. This study never went to FEMA. It never got their review or their blessing, so to speak. So it's not recognized on the FEMA maps as being an official study, but it's what the community recognizes as, quote, best available. And DNR Division of Water also recognizes it as best available data as well. So on their website, we looked at a minute ago, the floodway that you see, it may not show up too well on the screen, but the blue shading is the floodplain that was described or delineated. And then the floodway are these black lines that you see within there. So that DNR has incorporated that into their online mapping tool, so you don't have to go and chase down this old report. There aren't a whole lot of copies left in circulation to figure out, well, am I on a floodway or not here if I'm near Little Pigeon Creek? Some cases, if DNR hasn't done an assessment in their A-zone project, if FEMA hasn't looked at it, Corp and other agencies haven't looked at it, you need to figure out what's going on with my site. It's just an A-zone. You may need to do your own assessment. So that would involve, collecting survey data, building a model, doing a map, sending that to DNR and asking for their concurrence. When you do that, they will issue a floodplain analysis and regulatory assessment, or FARA, response to you. This is an example of what one would look like. This isn't the whole thing, but essentially it's a case number that you can reference with a date for your creek. You're, say, making a submittal for site review, and you need to say, hey, we've looked at the floodplain, we've reached out to DNR, this is what they've agreed with us, that this is a proper assessment of their jurisdiction and the BFEs for moving forward. One thing kind of related to that is that if you you have a site that is an A-zone and there is no floodway, there's no elevations, Division of Water will look at the entire flood plain and treat it as floodway until proven otherwise. If you don't know exactly where that line is, they're going to look to regulate that entire mapped area until someone strikes a line to better define their jurisdiction. So if you've got a site that you're working in, it's got a wide, expansive floodplain, doing an assessment may be worth your while if it may make your project not be as complicated and streamline things. But this response letter would be how you would get them to agree to that assessment should you do it. One aspect of this, I mentioned earlier, was the partnership between federal, state, and local. This is an excerpt from the Vanderburgh County Floodplain Ordinance. This is not unique to Vanderburgh County. This is essentially in all local ordinances in the state. DNR publishes a model floodplain ordinance that communities will work from to gather verbiage when they go to adopt their own ordinances or amendments to it. This provision here talks about when you do find discrepancies and maybe what might be mapped and what you would see on the ground if you went out and did a survey, or even we're just looking at LiDAR data. This clause here, G2 in this section, says that if the elevation at a site in question is actually found to be below the base flood elevation, but that it's mapped as being outside of the floodplain, locally it's still supposed to be regulated as if it is in. So that can cause some uncertainty in looking at a project, especially if you don't have an elevation with which to start. You may need to do an assessment to figure out where is the floodplain even at. That is something that could be dealt with and might affect the timeline for a project you might be looking at. And this link here is to get to the county ordinance. So that was kind of a very brief overview of some of the different places that you can find floodplain and floodway information. So if you want to do a project, you want to construct something, and you figured out, yeah, I'm in the floodway, I need to do an application, what are some of the basic things you might need to keep in mind going forward? The application itself looks pretty simple. Just by itself, it's just 2 pages. There's actually a lot more that goes into it. Some of the basic information that you need are contact info for the applicant for the permit, property owner if that's someone else, and then if they're working with a consultant or an engineer as their agent, that goes into the application, project location, directions on how to get there, a description of what you want to do. The description needs to be both detailed and brief at the same time. They like to see detailed dimensions and quantities, timetables, areas of impact, acreages, for example, in your description. If you get into some of their guidance they have on their website, they'll give you some templates that you can borrow from. Say if you're doing a bridge, they've got some bridge templates where you just fill in your numbers unique to your project, and that'll get you going in the right direction. Excuse me. Beyond that, you'll need to do a public notice to neighbors. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. A disturbed area drawing, quantifying the footprints and the locations of the areas inside the floodway that your project will disturb, either temporarily or permanently. They want to see photographs and then a map of essentially where you were standing when you took that picture and the direction that it's looking and the description of what you're seeing. It allows a reviewer who's maybe never set foot on that site to get a better feel for what's going on with your project location. The affirmation statement is a, I'm going to go to the next screen. That will maybe be a little bit more legible. The affirmation statement is essentially where the client would sign saying, yeah, this is what we're really going to do. It's an accurate representation of our project. And that's required. With paper form, you do it here. You can do a digital submittal, and then you actually get a form back that you sign, and then resubmit that as a follow-up submittal. You have to pay a fee. Generally, construction in a floodway permit is $200. You do it digitally, there's about a $15 electronic surcharge fee on top of that. I recommend doing it online. It's a lot faster rather than sending it in on paper. Then it goes into a queue in Indianapolis for someone to type into their system. You can type it in on your own. And when they first went to the digital option, they were estimating it would save about 2 weeks. I don't know if that's still the case, but in the past, that's what DNR was telling us. The other way of doing the application too, this is something brand new. I've actually not used this yet. The state has created an Indiana Waterways permit. So this is a screenshot of the Division of Water website. This red arrow here is making reference to that location. What they've created is a joint application between the Division of Water for floodways and with IDEM for the State 401 water quality certification, and in particular includes isolated wetlands. When you click on that, they've got some guidance here on how to go through this process. In a nutshell, what they've done is they've taken components of the DNR application, components of the IDEM application, and put them together all in one. But the overall intent is to avoid some of the redundancy. Say, for example, regurgitating the contact information, the project location, the driving directions, your description. That generally is going to be the same between the different agencies on what you're doing. So the idea is to streamline that process a little bit and get some more uniform feedback so that one agency isn't telling you something that differs from maybe what the other agency might have to say in their comments about your project. There again, it's new. I've not tried it, not talked to anybody yet who's actually gone through it, but I think it's a step in the right direction. The public notice. You have to notify your neighbors. You have to notify people that touch your property. They have some guidance in the Division of Water permit manual. This is a screenshot of some of that to give you some examples of who you notify. Generally, if the site on which you're working, I'm going to go back to this pointer here. So in this example, their project is at Site X. So they need to notify the owners of Lot A, if it's not the applicant, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H, and I. So in these cases, they just touch by a common point, not even a segment of their boundaries. And even if there was a county road here between these parcels, you skip over that right away and you still notify the people on the other side of the road. A little bit of a variation on that is down here. I'm not going to go through all of these, but in this case, if your neighbor's more than a quarter mile away from where you're working, you don't have to notify them, but you still have to notify the other people that are adjacent in that closer proximity to your work area. And this is in, like I said, the permit application manual. The website for this is here. The criteria that you need to do in your notice, you can do it one of three ways. You can notify them in a legal ad in the newspaper. You can do certified or first class U.S. mail, or you can do personal contact. What you actually send in the notice is a form. It is toggle this off. Let's see if this works here. Get this to load. Yeah. So this is that section of the website on the on the notice. So this is an example notice. Let me make this a little taller. What you see in the black text is their standard verbiage that you have to include in. This is their form N2. So it's the neighbor's contact info, the date, the applicant's contact information, the agent's contact information, and then who they should contact if they have questions, which you see in blue towards the bottom of the form. The second page is just part of the form. So I generally will print this sheet front and back, and then I will do a second sheet, staple it to it. With one side being a larger scale location map describing what's where the project is, and then on the back I'll put a detailed blow up of what's actually being done in the floodway, and maybe a paragraph or a few sentences of what's going on. And that's what goes to each of the neighbors as a notice. I recommend and have found that it's best to notify them via certified mail. That way you got proof when you get that green card, you get receipt back. Yeah, they did get it. If you do first class, you have to wait to, I believe it's 3 weeks, to give the post office a chance to return that letter. If it's undeliverable, or if they've moved, for example, the green cards or the certified mail should get delivered faster. Green cards don't always come back. I found here lately that sometimes they just never show up, or they may show up 2 or 3 months later. Fortunately, with that tracking number that you can get with a certified mailing, go to the post office website, run that tracking information, and get confirmation that yes, indeed, it was received. Notice period 2 runs for 30 days typically. The other form here, get ahead of myself, is this. After all that, you have confirmation of notice. There's another form to fill out that you, as the individual who did the notice, fill in who you contacted, and then check whether you sent them first class, certified, or talk to them individually, and the dates on which that happened. You have to notify everybody, and the date of the last notification kind of begins that 30-day clock on the public notice period. DNR will also publish a 30-day notice on their website, but whichever one starts last is what defines that 30-day window. And ideally, Division of Water, they'll do a cursory review just to see if you've got an incomplete application, if there's something glaring that's missing. But ideally, they wouldn't start doing a detailed assessment of your submittal until after that notice period has ended, so that if one of your neighbors has a concern, they have a chance in that 30-day window to reach out to DNR and say, hey, I've got questions, I have comments, I have concerns. And then after that point in time occurs, then the DNR reviewer can start to review the application, keeping in mind that comment that has come in, if any, in the public notice period. Usually you don't get a whole lot. Sometimes with a controversial project, there'll be a lot that comes in. If it's substantial, neighbors can petition to do a hearing. That's happened a couple of times over the years, but it's not very common. But in terms of time frame, that's kind of what goes on with the public notice on the permits. Wanted to touch briefly on some exemptions that exist. I'm not going to go into details on these. The link to get to this on the DNR website is here. For standard typical projects, most commonly I see this with outfalls, log jam removals. If you follow the criteria prescribed in these general licenses, say for example with log jam removal, kind of have to do the work by hand. You can't put a bulldozer or a track hoe down in the creek and start to pull stuff out. You're working with chainsaws and hand tools. Or on outfalls, you're limited on how much tree clearing you can do, how wide of a path you can ultimately use up for your outfall. Pipe sizes and other things like that are defined in there. If you meet that criteria, then you don't have to do a permit application. If you're not 100% confident that your project meets that criteria, it probably would be worthwhile to reach out to DNR and say, hey, this is what we're planning to do. We want to confirm that, yeah, we can work under the general license. It's always better to have something than nothing if there's a disagreement in the end on how they interpret your project. Especially, sometimes things happen on projects, changes happen, field changes occur. You need to keep this in mind with the terms of what's allowed in the general license if you want to take that route. Things like that do crop up. I mentioned permit applications can sometimes require HECRAS or hydraulic modeling, detailed calculations and models. You don't always have to do that. Projects that are more minor in terms of their impacts, ENR has created some forms that are called non-model assessments, and they've got a series of them that you see here on the screen. Depending upon where in the floodplain, floodway you're working and what you're doing and the impact that you're having, you may be able to demonstrate that your activity is minor, and you'd fill out the corresponding form here. To be able to do this, you kind of have to know what the floodplain is. If you're in an A zone, you don't have the data until you do a study to be able to answer the questions on these forms. They want to know, what are the elevations, what's the cross-sectional area of the channel or the floodplain, what's the cross-sectional area that you're going to impact of that. That's, if you don't have a study, you really can't do that. That kind of relates to one of the exhibits I mentioned earlier, which is the disturbed area drawing. You have to have that in mind and know what your project's going to be composed of before you can really work through this, so that you have some certainty in how you're responding to those questions on that form. The last page of each of these forms too is for DNR Fish and Wildlife. And that is what you're seeing here on the right. This is they call it their Fish, Wildlife, and Botanical Impact Assessment. Here too, they want you to quantify the number of acres in the floodway that you're going to disturb. And then once you have that established, you need to assess, of those disturbed areas, how much of it is wetland, that you see here in the bottom table, how much of it is just linear footage of stream impact, and how much of it might be other habitat that is not wetland, trees, even just vegetation that you wouldn't classify as trees or shrubs or whatnot. And that's going to pivot into potentially needing to do mitigation. But this form is required as part of the non-model assessment. I'll come back to mitigation in a second. If you don't meet the criteria for that that's set forth in those forms, you have to do a model. So we typically use the HEC-RAS or HEC-RAS software. It's developed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. You essentially define a series of cross-sections, flow rate, and you run that through those cross-sections. You find data about bridges, you find aspects of the cross-sections in terms of maybe where water's flowing, where it's not. HEC-RAS has gotten a lot more sophisticated in recent years. It was a replacement for an earlier program called HEC2, which was originally developed on mainframes. In the early days of the software, the work was actually done on punch cards. That's going back a while, but that was an improvement over what it replaced, which was slide rules and big sheets of paper. So HEC-RAS is a very user-friendly program. In a way that's good, in a way it's bad, because it'll run with really bad data. So part of doing an assessment is setting up your model, having some underlying assumptions and how you think the flow is going to move down your channel, setting your model up accordingly, running it, looking at the results to see if they match the assumptions that you had in mind going forward. Sometimes you got to go back and iterate, try things back and forth. It's not always straightforward. Key component of that, though, is your flow rate. You have to have a 100-year flow rate that Division of Water is on board with. If there's a value published in a FEMA FIS for the insurance study, that's what you need to use. You need to come up with one of your own. It's ideal to send that in to them first, make sure they're on board with it before you do a lot of time, put forth a lot of time and effort to do an analysis, and then come back and say, yeah, we don't like your flow rate, try again. Generally, you're going to be working with survey data, and you can supplement with that with LIDAR. LIDAR's gotten a lot better than it was in the earlier days. Generally, in my opinion, if LIDAR is going to be off, it's going to typically depict a higher elevation because of vegetation. So if you're using that in your assessment, you're only going to be more conservative in coming up with a floodplain elevation when you do that. So if you're going to build a house, you want to figure out what's my finished floor needs to be, LiDAR makes you more conservative, that house is going to be built slightly higher. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can create a lot of data and pull that out of the LiDAR very quickly with the software that we have now. Key thing about doing the model is not just one model. You've got to do 4 variations on it. That's if you're starting with an area that maybe FEMA or DNR has already studied. You'll begin with the model that maybe is on the book, so to speak. That's called the duplicate effective model. You'll get that input file. Hopefully it's not something you have to type in off of paper. But you'll get that loaded onto your system, run it with your software on your hardware, see if you get the same answer that's published in the FIS. If it's not, you may have some things to clean up, especially if you brought something in that was maybe the older HEC2. There were other programs that were used in the past. Part of the FIS for the city of Jasper, for example, was based on a USGS program that doesn't exist anymore. You can pull the data in, but some of the math is a little different. So sometimes you've got things to clean up to be able to recreate the base conditions in that duplicate model of the effective FIS. From there, you assess what was done at the time that study was published and analyzed. And you need to fix anything that they should have done differently. Today's standards are a lot more detailed than what people did even 10 or 15 years ago. So sometimes you may have some work to do on making a corrected model of what should have been done when that study was made. The next variation on the model that you need to look at in this process is the current conditions. That's where, since the time of the study, you will assess anything that's been done in your study reach, either with or without a permit, and see how that affects water elevations. And then from there, you'll do an assessment of what does my project do? If I want to put in a fill pad for a big box store, how does that change what's here now versus what was in the original study or the corrected study? That all then gets summarized in a big table, and you submit that with your application. Historically, DNR is one of the applications on paper. A couple I've done recently, I have submitted just PDFs, and so far they've accepted those. They're moving to a more digital world, and I'm all in favor of that too, because it's just so much more streamlined. So what that would look like in terms of that comparison is this. This is a summary table for a model I did for the Warwick Trail extension here in Warwick County that connected into Libert Road, just west of Walmart, or near the Burger King that's there now. So what you see in these different columns, here starting on the left are the cross sections that are in the model. What is published in the FIS for those cross sections is in this column. And then I've got the flow rate defined that was used. Went back. One thing I didn't say is that when you do these additional variations of your model from the base, you're going to add extra cross sections. You may have an area that you're interested in where your fill pad is going, or where your culvert is going to go, or whatever your project consists of. You need to define cross sections of those areas of interest, and you can capture that as a computational point in your assessment. So you have to go back and try and recreate, well, what should have been in the base model there as best you can to make those assessments. So if you see here, the FEMA study went from A to B, but I had to come in here and figure out, well, what did they have in here, and develop a cross section that would be representative of those original conditions. So that is that column. The corrected model, we had some minor tweaks to make. The current conditions, actually in this one, as I recall, were a little bit lower. The stream channel, I think, had eroded. The flow line was lower than what was in the model that was developed in the 1990s. I've seen that in other streams in the area. As you go back out, you compare an old study with modern survey data, and generally you're seeing erosion in a lot of the streams, and that the flow lines are lower. So you will see some cases it might actually drop a little bit, and other changes that have gone on in the floodplain. But this is that table. So this is a required component of a permit application if you have to do modeling. And they want to see a cross-section by cross-section comparison and show that none of your changes are more than the 1400s we talked about earlier. So in this case, with some of the fill for the proposed road, we did bump up to 1300s in this assessment, but that was okay. when you go through this process, you find that, hey, something's already happened and we're 0.2 of a foot higher than we should be, doesn't necessarily mean you can't do your project. You just have to find a way to do your project in such a way that your change is 0.00. We described earlier in Kentucky, for example. So if something's already bad, for lack of a better term, you just can't make it worse. But you can still find a way to proceed with your project. That's how you'd have to operate. If not, you may need to look at trying to do some kind of remediation to fix something that's causing that increase in the water elevations. In terms of those cross sections, this is what that might look like in plan view. So this was the map that I made for those cross sections. I'm going to zoom in on this area. So each of these red lines was a cross section that I created. We included the existing culverts, which you see here in black was the then proposed roadway. The yellow was the floodway from the FEMA study. This yellow dashed lines was a subsequent study. It was kind of a combination of work that our firm did and also Bernard and Lockmuller over the years. But each of these cross sections got added to capture different points of interest for the road project. And then, you know, these larger cross sections are what was in the FEMA study. And so that helps the reviewer get a feel for where are these cross sections, and so they can review, excuse me, what you've submitted. Another component of an application for the permit involves considerations for historical structures and archaeological sites. When you apply for a permit, it's just not to the Division of Water. I mentioned Fish and Wildlife earlier. I'm going to mention Historic Preservation Archaeology, or SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office, as it's referred to. Those other agencies look at applications as well. If you have archaeological sites, Native American sites, those reports and a lot of that data is confidential. You have to be a registered archaeologist to get that. So we've had to bring in some archaeologists on projects in the past to work through that with them. For things that aren't as sensitive in their nature, in the past, the state had published their county survey books. Those have now gone digital. So what you're seeing on the screen are the dots and the sites that were in those maps. It's a lot easier for them to update rather than republishing printed books each time. You can click on these sites and get information about each of them, and the National Register sites show up in here as well. The couple other, we're starting to run out of time, so I want to try and speed through some of this. Some other sites of reference or interest on the Division of Water website. When you get into it, the DNR page, and then into water, these are the three areas that are most applicable to this subject matter: regulatory, surface water, and their forms. One of them is the Online Research Center. It is a link available here. It will give you a map of previously established case numbers, where it's permits, violations, or just inquiries. One thing about this is you do have to go into the legend and actually turn these on, these blue check boxes. When you first come into it, everything is off. And then you can click on those dots and get some information about that site. So once you have a case number, another website that is relatively new is their Unity database portal. Once you have that case number, you can come in here and look things up. So a floodway permit, for example, starts with FW. There are other types of cases that they will issue. You get into the website, you can type in the number. So this was the permit application we worked on for the LST relocation. You type it in, it comes back, it found it. And then as you get into it, this drop down here allows you to get into some of the data they have. Most notably is the attachments option here. A lot of this is grayed out to the public. It's just internal to DNR staff. When you click on it, you're supposed to be able to see the submittals, the correspondence, and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes it just doesn't work. I get this screen a lot. It says, "Loading, please wait," and it never loads. If that happens, you can reach out to DNR and say, "Look, I tried the website. I need to track down some information for my project. It's applicable to what I'm doing," and they generally can get you what you need. In addition to reaching out to them, you can do early coordination. What I call technical and administrative is if you have a complex project, after the fact permit, or maybe an FIS study that's really old with old software, it's probably best to reach out to them and say, look, guys, this is how I'm planning on approaching this project, this permit. Are you on board with that? And get everybody on the same page. You can also do environmental early coordination with Fish and Wildlife. This is an excerpt from their site on what they want to see, where to send it. Those folks are generally pretty good about getting back with you in 30 days or less. They just want a general idea of what your project is. If you have any endangered species, though, this is where it'll show up. They have a database citing or records of previous endangered species sightings or observations, and if one of those do show up, you may have some extra things to work through on your project. This is a sample response for an inquiry to Fish and Wildlife for their early coordination. This is basically a precursor to some of the conditions that will show up in your permit when it gets issued. They talk about mitigation. They talk about endangered species. Some of the key things in here that you normally will see are not doing work in the channel from April 1st to June 30th, and also not clearing trees that might be suited for endangered bat habitat or endangered bat species, their habitat, from April 1st to September 30th. We talk about replantings, disturbed areas, and wildlife passage considerations and things of that nature. But this is a pretty standard list of what you can expect to see on almost any application from Fish and Wildlife. The mitigation, though, from Fish and Wildlife, they look to mitigate impacts to wildlife habitat. Doesn't really have to do so much from their point of view with water flow. Their guidelines are available here. I'm trying to speed this up a little bit since we're essentially out of our time. But with any site, whether it's DNR, Corp and IDNR wetlands, for example, they first want you to avoid their jurisdiction, then minimize what you can avoid, and then third, mitigate for what you've minimized. The Fish and Wildlife jurisdiction is only in the floodway. You may have habitat impacts outside of that, but that's not what DNR's jurisdiction is. It's common to see ratios for mitigation if you're doing impacts of 1:1 to 4:1 or higher, if it's something is a unique ecosystem. If it's also a wetland, you're going to start out with higher ratios than if it were a non-wetland wooded corridor along a stream. If you're going to impact more than an acre of streams, you start at a ratio of 2:1. Below that, you're at 1:1. The guidelines have criteria for mitigation plan, maintenance, doing subsequent monitoring and reporting. That typically would go on for 3 to 5 years. You need to replant large trees, small trees, shrubs, and then ground cover. One thing that's not an option right now is a pending change with the Natural Resources Commission is the ability to pay into the state in lieu fee fund in lieu of building your own mitigation site. Sitting here today, you can't do that, but that is something that is in the works. I'm told that that may actually become an option yet before the end of the year. But with COVID and everything, that may be up in the air. One thing I wanted to show you is this document here, if it will load. These are the costs that they have if you want to buy into that fund. So we're in the Ohio Wabash area. The stream impacts are $400 a linear foot. That can add up quickly. And wetland or acres of impact is typically what's associated with a credit. It is $80,000 each. So there again, the importance of avoiding and minimizing. If you don't do that, that can add up really quickly if you want to take this route instead of building your own mitigation site. That is subject to change. It's not in effect yet. This was an example of mitigation we did on a project here for the city recently. There was a slide out along the greenway that was near the levee. It was a project that involved working with the levee authority, Parks Department, Corps of Engineers, DNR. So the slide area was repaired, and then there were some tree plantings that were done over near the Heidelbach canoe launch to offset the trees that were lost in the process of making that repair. In this case, I think it was a 5:1 ratio. It wasn't in an urban area. You can look at the number of large trees you take out, mitigate at 5:1 as opposed to just acreages. And the guidelines have different thresholds, whether if you do plantings, whether you do bare root seedlings, container trees, or larger bald and burlap species. A couple of real quick examples. and one thing too, what can trigger when you need an application for a floodway permit? It's basically anything in the floodway. The local floodplain ordinance, this is an excerpt again from Vanderburgh County, talks about the definition of development, and about anything other than farming. See here at the bottom some things that do not trigger the definition of development, or painting, roofing, paving a road, gardening, plowing, so on. But so many of these other activities that occur, whether it's construction, utilities, dredging, mining, storing material, developments, anything that would, this last one is sort of a catch-all, anything that would change the direction, height, or velocity of water. One key takeaway though is that residential is not allowed in the floodway in Indiana. This was one of our applications I worked on, LST relocation, involved a mooring barge, dredging. We had to coordinate with historic preservation because the ship was on the National Register of Historic Places. But that was a completed project. I worked on a pedestrian bridge at Freedman Park. It's a small footbridge to connect the golf course with the park. This one we had to do an assessment to come up with what the flow rate was. And then that area had been impacted by mining, some of the pits that are out there. So that was part of that process. Warwick Trail I mentioned earlier, we did a culvert extension to widen Liberty roads. We had to do modeling on it. Worked on the Scales Lake spillway replacement in Boonville. We do modeling for both the flow rate to see how that would move through the new spillway. It's a much larger spillway now than what had been there previously. And then this last example is for a permit I did for Intel Water and Sewer for dredging its municipal water intake. That project actually involved floodway permits in Indiana and Kentucky because it crossed the state line from the work area, but there was no modeling. Lastly, what does a permit look like? So this is the permit for that dredging project, the water intake. It essentially includes the contact information that you included on your application, that brief yet detailed project description, location, approval date. You can appeal your application. In particular, if some of the conditions that we'll see on the next screen are too excessive in your opinion and you want to try and get that modified, you can appeal your own permit. I've never gone through that process, never had a client want to do that. These are general conditions that essentially talk about coordinating with other agencies, find archaeological artifacts, and can contact DNR for more questions if you have them. And it gives DNR permission to enter the work site to inspect to make sure you're complying with your permit. The special conditions are more unique to each project, but essentially this is the list you would have seen earlier in your early coordination letter from Fish and Wildlife. That is usually what you see here. It goes on to the next page about not leaving debris in the floodway, site stabilization. And in this case, we were on the river, so we had some extra conditions there in terms of navigation. And then letters now define what is defined as what is established rather as the floodway in terms of the context of this permit. Older permits didn't show this, and as maps have changed over the years, sometimes that became a gray area. So this is something you will now see on each permit. And then lastly, they send the notice then to neighbors, and then some folks within DNR, and then local government and other state and federal agencies. So with that, that is my presentation. If there are any questions, I'd be inclined to take and do my best to answer them. But there's a lot of other things that are other aspects of this that you could talk on for several days, to be honest, but tried to pull together just an overview of what this involves and what some of the layers of the onion are, so to speak.
Thank you, Michael. You did a great job. I want to thank the attendees. If anybody's got a question they would like for Michael to address, just go ahead.
I see one question in the chat. It says, are residences allowed if they are elevated? There are some provisions along the Ohio River for river camps. If there are existing residences that were built prior to, say, the flood insurance study being published or the floodway being established, those can remain. There are provisions in there, say, for example, though, if that structure gets damaged, either from a fire or a flood or a tornado, if it's minor damage, and the ordinance kind of prescribes what minor is, you can rebuild. If it's major, you can rebuild, but you have to bring the site into compliance in terms of elevation. So there are some, like I said, some unique things for river camps. There's a couple of very unique exceptions in the code. One is Harbor's Edge here in Evansville, and the other is a development in the city of Jasper on Patoka that actually have unique sections of the state code that allows them to be there, that took an act of the state legislature to make happen. But by and large, new residences are not allowed in the floodway, with very, very few exceptions.
Thank you. That was my question. It's exactly what I was wondering about.
Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate everyone's time today. There again, I'm going to make this available as a PDF with the hyperlinks. I know I went through a lot today, and just to sit there and listen and try and take it all in without that might not have been the most effective thing, but hopefully this will be something you can go back and check in the future if it's of interest to you and it's applicable to something that you're working on. If people have questions and want to reach out to us, and try and help them if we can. And so I'll offer that too if people have inquiries going forward.
May I make one more comment, Mr. Chair?
I'm sorry, what was that?
I said, may I make one more comment? I posted in the chat, but you may not see it, Michael, but it's obvious to me that this is not a simple process. And it's nice that we got pros in the market that do this work so effectively. So we sure appreciate having this presentation, but please be sure it's labeled so you can be available if members and others have questions. We wouldn't want them to try to ask someone like me to answer them. Like make sure they get connected with you. So
Very well. Thank you. All right.
Thanks again, Michael. Great job.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.